topic, we could expand it also to India. Given what's happened in the current days, does India need a stable government versus a coalition government, given what's happened yesterday and today?
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, I think I'm very mindful, ladies and gentlemen, of the context in which we speak. At one time, I thought this was probably a very inappropriate debate given the day.
True.
Partly because today we are facing a moment where national solidarity, rather than national differences, should be highlighted. Nevertheless, I think when the Debating Society of India organized this debate, they were not soothsayers and they didn't anticipate it. So rather than sour their program, I think we'll do a bit of play acting for the moment and pretend that it's normal times. But remember, it is not normal times. Ladies and gentlemen, I had a look at the sort of demographic profile, and that's a sort of occupational hazard of anyone who's in politics these days, is to look at the demographic profile of the audience. And I came to this conclusion that, like me, most of you are into nostalgia. I think a lot of us remember the days when we could tune on, in those innocent days as we like to call it, when we could tune on to one television station, where the idea of remote control didn't happen. We remember the days of endless queues. Queues for this, queues for railway tickets, the one airline which we flew. We also remember, not that long ago, another time when we had recurrent political crises. Almost on a bi-monthly basis. When we know, is the government going to survive? Is the government going to fall? And then as journalists, I remember the anodyne saying, oh, the next 24 hours is going to be very crucial. We remember the time, again going back to nostalgia, when almost every second day was a scam a day. When the amounts involved ran into trillions or even more. And headlines used to have more zeros than they had space for. We remember the times, again if we want to be nostalgic, when we thought that the future of India lay in buying a one-way ticket out. And a lot of our children have exercised that unfortunate option, I may hasten to add. Was that a great time for nostalgia? We remember the days when bombs used to go off in the marketplaces. When we had terrorists attacking us for 3 days. When the only response was, we will use all diplomatic means necessary in our command. When we took out candlelight marches and expressed our indignation and thought, well, really, we've defeated the terrorists morally. To defeat terrorists morally, defeating people who lack morals morally must be a great achievement, no doubt. I must compliment ourselves for having that great insight into that. But I think over the past 4 or 5 years, there's been a certain transformation in India. And I think the transformation has come about, some would say it's come about because there's a man with a 52-inch chest somewhere there. But I think the transformation has come about partly because the electorate, in its wisdom, in 2014 said, enough is enough. And that there is a need, if this country is to survive, if this country is to go ahead, if this country is to get out of the stigma of being a sort of, unfortunate third world nation, then we need to be a little more decisive in our choices. And that decisive choice is what confers certain advantages to a prime minister. If we want to regress, I think regression is very easy. If we want to go back to the days of where the next 24 hours is going to be crucial, whether the government will survive, whether we do not know how to deal with certain attacks, where we cannot exercise the more difficult options, where we cannot roll back for the first time in 50 years the advancing tide of corruption, which is really the biggest strength, the biggest achievement of this government, having exercised difficult and what was thought to be impossible options of actually taking on. If we want to vote in the coming elections for another election, if we want to make elections an annual affair, then I suggest we exercise the choice of coalitions. Otherwise, we are on a good path. Let us stick to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Swapan. I'll just open it up to those opposing the motion. And who would like to ask the first question? There are two questions from the opposing side to Swapan. Rebuttal in a sense.
So according to you, Rafale is an act of charity and contribution to the larger, underprivileged class of India, and Rafale is obviously just a figment of a wild imagination of the opposition.
I think it is to a very considerable extent a figment of your imagination. It was an imagination which didn't appeal to people like the Supreme Court of India. It was an imagination that didn't appeal to the Comptroller and Auditor General. And therefore, it must have been an imagination which was slightly limited in its scope and magnitude. I think the most important thing, as I want to say, is that, and this is a more serious point, is that corruption in India has not ended, but we have started rolling back the tide of corruption. We can no longer say it's getting worse every year. We can no longer, just as we no longer say inflation is terrible, we can no longer say that, because it isn't. And it's a similar case. And there are a lot of people who've been hurt by this, and understandably have hurt. Just to take a small example, there have been 8 crore fraudulent beneficiaries who've been weeded out, not necessarily only by technology, but also by an exercise of political will. There has also been one class which has been rendered unemployed, particularly in Lachin's Delhi, and that's the class called the middlemen and brokers.
But Mr. Dasgupta, as elections get more expensive every year, how are you saying corruption is coming down every year?
Elections and corruption are two different things. One is election is where the elections are the costliest? Elections are the costliest in southern India. And it's probably the cheapest in Bihar and West Bengal. So there is, to some extent, an inverse relationship between economic growth and election expenses. It's an interesting point. But I think the more important thing is that as we get more and more technologically savvy, and if we can stop the idea of retail corruption in elections, whereby the voter slip is accompanied by a 500 rupee note, as often happens in southern India, as you well know, Sonia. We've all seen it in our thing. And this is a malaise, I think, which needs to be tackled. And I think it's a national problem. It's not something which is confined to one political party. It's confined, as I said, we have only begun rolling back the tide of corruption. It's a huge war ahead of us.
Mr. Gulcharan Das?
Both coalitions, governments, as well as single-party governments have succeeded and failed. The It's clearly a single party government. We've had terrible examples. The emergency, we had demonetization, we had license permit Raj. They were the product of single party governments. And there have been good coalition governments, the Rainbow Coalition in Germany, which presided over the golden years of Germany's economic growth. So I'm not persuaded by you that necessarily it is single party growth. However, I also am sympathetic, because I'm not either on one or the other side. I'm sympathetic to the fact that India's political culture, it depends on a country's political culture. And in India, the issue is not accountability when you have an election every month. The issue is state capacity. And what we need to do is to enhance state capacity through major reforms. And that I personally think, I can't imagine a coalition government doing that.
I think, Gurcharan, you're quite right. There are certain countries where, because of the vagaries of the electoral system, you always have coalitions. Germany is one, Israel is another. You always have. You cannot probably envisage a situation where you don't have coalitions. But there are coalitions and coalitions. We, I believe, and I think the first word in the subject talked about India. India. We are talking about the coalition culture in India. And Mr. Karnik is here, who spends a lot of time in Bangalore. I think he might know the experience of what coalition culture does in Bangalore. We also have a certain situation where in the past we have members with 2 or 3 member parties which can put a veto on an entire system. We had in 1996-97 one person who said, I don't like the idea that the Tatas and Singapore Airlines should have flying rights. He was a lobbyist for some one particular group, which has probably gone bankrupt now. And he exercised that option. In other words, every single particular lobby, and in India, like in any other democracy, lobbies exist. And as they should exist, perhaps. But when that lobby exercises a power of veto, which is what coalitions end up doing, and this, at this time, when our growth story is such that we have to exercise difficult choices, that difficult choices cannot, given the coalition culture in India, be exercised if sort of different, a rainbow coalition of somebody who believes in caste politics, somebody who believes in maverick politics, somebody who believes in special status, somebody who believes that the right of the coalition should be to exonerate people from jail. If these diverse ideas are brought about, I think it's not merely anarchy, but it's probably the end of India's growth story. Once again, India will become a might have been story.
Right. Mr. Dasgupta, thank you for that. And of course, it's interesting, this is at a time when the BJP also is looking at new alliances and coalitions, so that's an interesting point.